Boyd Barrett.
Minister, there is no doubt, and indeed we have been the first to say, and most loudly saying in here, that the Assad regime is a brutal, callous, murderous, authoritarian regime supported by a very cynical Russia. And I have no doubt about the brutalities that they have committed and are capable of committing. But the idea that US, UK and French missiles and a massive dose of hypocrisy and double standards coming from those powers are going to assist in the humanitarian disaster in Syria is quite frankly stomach-churning. And for government representatives to talk about the attacks being understandable is really quite shocking. And let me just refer to the double standards we're talking about. In 2009, Israel rained down chemical weapons in the full view of day, white phosphorus, on the UN school in Gaza and on densely populated areas. There was a report done by Human Rights Watch afterwards called Rain of Fire, Israel's unlawful use of white phosphorus in Gaza. This was well documented and proven. The shells were found all around the place, chemical weapons. Guess where they were produced? Louisiana in the United States. Were there sanctions? No. Was there expulsions of diplomats? No. Was there threats of military action by these politicians who told us, in the context of bombing Syria, that they couldn't sleep? They couldn't sleep, Count Corla, at the thought of the use of chemical weapons. But they were able to sleep very soundly when Israel rained down chemical weapons on the people of Gaza. Incredibly, the Israelis at the weekend said it was absolutely right to take military action to uphold international law. But in the last few weeks, 36 Palestinians killed, unarmed Palestinians marching to assert their rights under international law, to return to their homes as confirmed by UN resolutions. Sanctions? No. Military action? No. Expulsions? No. This sort of rank hypocrisy is corrosive of politics. It is actually what is responsible for the mess that is in the Middle East. The cynical interference of big powers, whether it's Russia, whether it's Donald Trump, Theresa May and Macron, trying to shore up their collapsing popularity by trying to divert people's attention with a war abroad and furthering the interests of imperial powers in that region, trying to gain influence on the backs of the suffering of the Syrian people. Now, we have to speak out against this sickening hypocrisy and have nothing to do with this murderous assault by Trump and his gang of allies.
That's exactly what the EU is doing, is to advocate for all military activity in Syria. Because there are no solutions in Syria that can be delivered through military means alone. Not that it'll last anyway. The apparent chemical attack in the city of Douma in Syria on the 7th of April was horrifying, even by standards set by the Syrian conflict to date. It was distressing to see images of children choking to death, their lives cut short by a conflict that they don't understand and aren't involved in. Whole families were wiped out in basements where they had sought shelter from bombs falling overhead. I remember very similar images. When I visited Halabja, I think I said that when Mick and others were asking questions previously, and I spoke to families that witnessed similar incidents back in 1998 or 1988. And I think that, let me just be very clear on a number of things before I deal with the military intervention. Ireland condemns the use of chemical weapons by anyone, anywhere and in any circumstances. And I'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate my unreserved condemnation of this particular callous act on civilians, women and children in particular. On the 14th of April, as others have raised, the US, France and the UK launched a series of strikes on a number of facilities which have been linked to the Syrian government's use of chemical weapons. From what we were told yesterday, notice was given to ensure that there were no civilian casualties. Their stated objective was to ensure that such attacks do not reoccur, and when something as horrific as this happens in terms of chemical attacks, what I said was that I could understand why, in the absence of the UN Security Council being able to take action because of a repeated use of a veto, I can understand why military strikes happened. That is not the same as an implicit endorsement or support for that action. Last week I was asked in advance of military strikes happening, but when they were being talked about, I urged caution, and I said very clearly that I didn't see how further military activity in Syria would add to an already very difficult situation. That's what I said. And yesterday, when I spoke at the Foreign Affairs Council, I continued to urge caution. And I asked that the focus be on political solutions, as indeed is the... And for anyone who actually sees the resolution that was agreed and reads it all, you'll see that there is a short reference to military strikes, but all of the emphasis is on about humanitarian support, about accountability in Syria and legal mechanisms to deliver that, about inspections, about a more comprehensive UN response, and a Syria conference which will be held next week in Brussels, where Ireland will make a significant financial contribution on top of the contribution that we've already made towards supporting the hundreds of thousands, and in fact millions of refugees that need international assistance. Yesterday, as I said, I discussed the situation in Syria with my EU colleagues at the Foreign Affairs Council. We condemned in the strongest possible terms the use of chemical weapons in Syria and stressed the need to ensure full legal accountability for those responsible for such crimes. The horrors inflicted by the Assad regime on their own people is where our focus should stay. We also reiterated our support for the UN-led political negotiations to end the conflict and the urgent need to reinvigorate that political track.
Saying that the attacks were understandable in any shape or form is tacit support. And quite frankly, you are not applying uniform or consistent standards when it comes to the behaviour of the big powers who dominate and who are currently paralysing the UN Security Council. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? When people like Macron or May or Trump or Israel, cheering them on, say we must uphold international law and the prohibition on chemical weapons, and you know and I know that these same powers have used chemical weapons and nobody said a bloody word when they did it in Gaza. No sanctions, no expulsions. Nobody saying it would be understandable if Hamas lobbed a few rockets back in retaliation. I bet you wouldn't say that. Right? That's double standards. And that double standards fuels the conflict that is tearing the Middle East apart.
Thank you, Deputy Paul.
I mean, actually, my record in relation to disagreeing with the US on certain issues in the UN is pretty strong. We voted against the US in relation to, or we voted for a motion that was very critical of the US in terms of the Jerusalem issue, despite being asked not to. So, I mean, I think my record is pretty clear on that. But I don't think some of the comparisons are relevant. The idea that you would be equating condemnation for the use of chemical weapons on women and children with actually the need to condemn airstrikes on buildings where notice was given to make sure that no civilians were killed or injured is warped, as far as I'm concerned. What I have said is that I condemn any chemical attack on any population, military or civilian. We are trying to get chemical weapons out of use permanently. And the reason why the motivation for targeted strikes was to act as a very clear deterrent to make sure that we don't see repeated use of chemical weapons on civilian populations and on targets in Syria. which is a country that's already been ripped apart by war, and now we're seeing repeated use of chemical weapons there. And I said that that response, in the absence of the UN Security Council being able to respond comprehensively, was understandable. I didn't say I supported it, but I can understand the motivation behind it. That's all I said yesterday. I listened to the French Minister and British Minister outlining in detail why they took part in that action. I responded by saying that I felt that the focus should not be on military strikes, but should be on diplomatic and political solutions, which is what the European Union has been pushing for and supporting the UN on for some time now. And that is where I think Ireland can be relevant and focused. We have no role in terms of military strikes, and we have no capacity. And I think that, after they have taken place, for me to be strongly critical wouldn't have achieved anything. Instead, what I want to try and focus on is a positive agenda that the EU and UN working together are trying to achieve, which is the implementation of ceasefires that have been signed up to but are being ignored. And so we will continue to focus on trying to actually create positive outcomes that can see an absence of the kind of continuing military activity and misery that we're seeing across Syria.
Thank you very much, Tánaiste. That concludes our consideration of today's topical issues. We move now to the